The Middle Ages are often called the Dark Times, but some may argue that isn't fair. After all, that's when they came up with windmills, Gothic style, typography, keyboard instruments, and glasses. Moreover, the medieval castles had the most exciting events happen there: intrigues, tournaments, and magnificent feasts. Hey guys, welcome to our channel. So today we're going to talk about some facts about life in a medieval castle, so each of you can decide whether to think of it as an amazing place or a dark hotbed of stench, dirt, and disease. I'd like to start off by saying that many of us have this idea in our heads that a castle was a high, beautiful building where the king and his family lived, but that isn't entirely true. The term castle means a fortification, that is, fortress walls that protect a variety of buildings. And the building in which a noble feudal lord lived is a palace. Back in the 10th and 11th centuries, the castle looked more like a fortified camp. In the center of the space, surrounded by a moat and a rampart with a palisade, there was the only long-term building, a donjon, which was a round or rectangular tower 2 or 3 stories high, made of wood or stone. In addition to being the key defensive structure, the donjon was also the residence. There were 1 or 2 halls on each floor. The rest of the buildings resembled a farm or a village, where people settled as best they could. In case of serious danger, all these buildings were simply destroyed, and all the inhabitants of the quote-unquote castle took refuge in the donjon, where there was a chance to wait out a long siege. Because of all the movies we've seen, we're used to thinking that the castle's interior was always gray and dull. But in fact, noble people loved bright colors and often decorated the interior of their homes. However, most of us don't know about it because the paints weren't preserved for us to see. Now, until the 13th century, castles were extremely cold and dark. There were virtually no windows in the castle. They were most often replaced by numerous small slots in the walls. Such narrow window openings didn't only have a defensive function, but were also designed to protect the privacy of the inhabitants of the castle. Thus, there was virtually no sunlight in the rooms. The walls couldn't warm up, and lighting was also a problem. Seeing anything was only possible during the day, but even then the lighting was very poor, because the glass was very different from the modern kind and didn't transmit sunlight well. Torches were effective at illuminating the room, but they gave a lot of soot and spoiled furniture and carpets. Only with the advent of the Gothic style did the windows become larger. Fireplaces also weren't invented right away. Until the middle of the Dark Ages, the premises were heated by an open fire. A fire was lit in the central hall, and the smoke escaped through a hole in the ceiling. It wasn't the best way to warm up. Moreover, there was the constant smell of burning and soot on the walls. Heating was mainly provided by the kitchen hearth, fireplace, stoves, and braziers. The fireplace chimney was designed in a way that took away a lot of the heat because of the strong draft. So they tried to compensate for the shortcoming by using a brazier. It wasn't uncommon to only provide heating for the bedroom. The inhabitants of the house wore warm clothes, such as furs, and got sick often. The rooms in the castle were spacious and bore little resemblance to the modern dwellings. It was rather common to only have a couple of large halls and several secret passages in the entire building. This inconvenience was partially dealt with by zoning the halls with carpets. They were attached to the door and window frames. If necessary, all of the partitions could be removed, for example, during large receptions, festivities, or during the summer months. In the early Middle Ages, all the inhabitants of the castle slept together in the same room: the nobility, the soldiers guarding the castle, and the servants. They were separated only by curtains or screens, and less often, by wooden partitions. Later, the owner of the castle and his wife had separate rooms. Their chambers were called sunny because they had large windows, which meant that more light penetrated into them than into other rooms of the castle. One of the favorite pastimes of the nobility in the Middle Ages was hunting. They also enjoyed listening to the wandering minstrels in the evening, during or after dinner. But they didn't only do it for the love of art. It was like watching the news every night. Tournaments were regularly held on the territory of the medieval castle. Now, contrary to stereotypes that have developed through historical novels and cinema, these were exclusively sporting competitions or staged fights, and not duels. Hunger was a constant companion of medieval people, even the nobility. Therefore, the inhabitants of the castles saw feasts as a time for gluttony. Some people continued eating until they were sick. The seating of the guests at the feast corresponded to their status. The most important people sat on a pedestal at the head of the table, towering over the rest. Toilets were sometimes arranged under their seats. The least important attendees sat on wooden benches by the exit at the back of the hall. The inhabitants of the castle were in a state of constant intoxication, although not a strong one. The nobility drank wine, beer, and spirits. The servants drank whatever they could find. No one really drank any water. It was heavily contaminated, and they didn't know how to disinfect it, so they just added alcohol to it. Therefore, even children drank alcohol at the time. The problems with cleanliness and hygiene in the Middle Ages have long become legendary. The floors in the castles were always very dirty. There were leftovers of food, drinks, and excrement of dogs, cats, and rats. Servants regularly swept the floors and covered them with reeds and various herbs to keep up the appearance of cleanliness and kill the awful smell. There was no running water or sewerage. Back then, it was customary to wipe oneself with a wet towel instead of washing up in the morning, even in high society. Taking a bath required some setting up. They used a large wooden bucket, and the servant had to carry hot water to fill it. However, people of that time were suspicious of washing their bodies. Nudity was considered a sin, and it was always cold. One could get sick. Queen of Spain Isabella of Castile, end of the 15th century, admitted that she'd taken a bath only twice in her life, at birth and on her wedding day. There was a well-known story that the Versailles guides liked to tell about the ambassador of Spain who came to visit the king. As the ambassador went into the king's room, it was in the morning, he got into an awkward situation. His eyes started watering from the smell. The ambassador politely asked to move the conversation to the park and ran out of the royal bedroom. He'd hoped that he'd be able to breathe fresh air in the park. However, the unfortunate ambassador simply fainted from the stench there, since the bushes in the park served as a latrine for all courtiers, and the servants poured out sewage there too. The toilets were small hallways with benches and holes in them. The contents of the toilet fell down the gutters from a great height into a cesspool or a moat. Since the moat was usually closed, the stench was unbearable, especially in the summer. Moreover, it was impossible to spend a long time there, since there were no partitions between the toilet spots. They were only introduced during the late Middle Ages. Toilets were called garderobe. One of the reasons for such a name was the fact that clothes were stored there, because it was believed that ammonia scared away moths, fleas, lice, and ticks. Sometimes toilets were set up in isolated rooms, which essentially hung from the walls of the castle, and the sewage from it flowed down the outer walls. In the earliest Middle Ages, there were no designated toilets at all. It is known, for example, that in the Louvre and Versailles, everyone did their business wherever. When the stench got so bad that it was impossible to stay in the castle, the nobility moved to another place for the time of cleaning and airing. Then they started using pots, the contents of which were poured out the window or into the moat with water. There wasn't any waste disposal or garbage disposal. The unpaved streets of medieval cities quickly turned into swamps of sticky mud. All the dirt and the terrible sanitary conditions of the medieval cities contributed to frequent epidemics. Well, that's all for today. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Let me know what you learned. Would you like to go back to medieval times now? Or do you like taking warm showers every single day? Be sure to subscribe to our channel too while you're at it, and we'll see you next time.